dare you embarrass me in my own house? I'm so sorry, ma'am. Get out of my house. You're fired.
I've learned that the people who shout the loudest about where they came from are usually the ones running fastest from it. Before we start, if stories like this move you, consider subscribing to My Coin. We tell them because somewhere, someone needs to hear that pride always meets its match. The Adeyemi mansion in Ikoyi sat behind gates so tall that the neighborhood children called it the wall that ate the sky. On the night this story begins, every window blazed gold, and the compound smelled of jollof rice, roasted goat, and the particular anxiety of people trying too hard to impress each other. Folake Adeyemi stood at the center of her own engagement dinner, like a queen surveying a kingdom she had built from nothing. Or so she liked to say. In truth, she had married into it. 3 years ago, she had been a marketing executive with good instincts and better ambition. Now she was the future wife of Chief Bayo Adeyemi, construction magnate. And she had learned to wear wealth the way some women wear perfume. Applied heavily, reapplied often, until the room could smell nothing else. "Careful with that tray," she said to the woman in the black and white uniform moving among the guests. "These glasses cost more than you'll make this month." The woman, introduced to the staff simply as Rose, new hire, did not flinch. She adjusted the tray of wine glasses balanced against her forearm and continued serving with the quiet efficiency of someone who had done this work, or work like it, for a long time. Her hands were steady. Her eyes moved slowly across the room, cataloging faces the way an accountant catalogs numbers. What Folake did not know, what nobody at that dinner knew, except for one nervous house manager sweating through his agbada in the kitchen, was that Rose was not a maid at all. Her real name was Adaeze Chukwuma, and 6 months earlier, Forbes Africa had placed her net worth at $412 million, built from a logistics empire that moved goods through 14 countries before her 40th birthday. She had grown up in Ajagunle, in a room with a tin roof that turned every rainfall into a drum solo, and she had promised herself 2 things when the money finally came: that she would never forget the sound of that rain, and that she would never trust anyone who claimed to have not forgotten it either. Not until she tested them herself. So twice a year, Adaeze disappeared. She told her board she was doing due diligence on human capital, which was true in the driest possible sense. She hired herself out through a domestic staffing agency under a false name, took whatever placement came up, and worked. Not for a week. Not for a photo opportunity. She worked until something true revealed itself about the people she served. And then she left, usually before anyone learned who she really was. Tonight, the agency had placed her with Chief Adeyemi's household for what was supposed to be a modest family dinner. Instead, she'd arrived to find 200 guests, a live band flown in from Accra, and a bride-to-be who treated the serving staff like furniture that occasionally needed correcting. Rose. Folake's voice cracked across the room again, sharper this time. The Dom Perignon. Not the sparkling wine you gave the Okonkwo's. Some of us know the difference. A ripple of laughter moved through the nearby guests, the practiced, complicit laughter of people who understood that laughing was cheaper than disagreeing with the host. Adaeze inclined her head. Of course, madam, she had heard worse. She had said worse once, a long time ago, back when she was 26 and freshly successful, and terrified that anyone might mistake her for who she used to be. It had taken her a decade to understand that the people who mocked service were usually the ones most afraid of ending up in it. Across the room, Chief Bayo Adeyemi watched his fiancée work the crowd and felt the small, cold weight in his chest that had been growing there for months. He was 61, a man who had built roads and bridges and apartment towers with his bare ambition. And he had thought, when he met Folake at a gala 18 months ago, that her fire was the thing missing from his life. His first wife, Ngozi, dead 6 years now from an illness that took her slowly enough for him to say everything he needed to say, had been quiet, gentle. He had told himself he wanted the opposite this time. He was beginning to suspect he had confused fire with cruelty. "She's a lot," his sister Yatunda murmured, appearing at his elbow with 2 glasses of Chapman. "The maid didn't do anything wrong." "I know," Bayo said. "Then why do you look like a man watching his house burn down and calling it decoration?" He didn't answer. He watched Folake laugh too loudly at her own joke, watched the new maid absorb the insult without so much as a change in her breathing. And something in him, some old instinct from the days before he had money to insulate him from consequences, told him to pay closer attention. Dinner was served at 8. Long tables draped in white ran the length of the garden, lit by strings of warm bulbs that made everyone look 10 years younger and considerably richer than they were. Adaize moved between the tables with the other staff, refilling glasses, clearing plates, absorbing the conversations of Lagos's moneyed class the way a sponge absorbs water. Without comment, without visible reaction, she heard a property developer boast about underpaying his workers and calling it efficiency. She heard 2 women discuss, in the particular hushed voice reserved for gossip, whether Folake had married Bayo for love or for the 4 apartment complexes in his name. She heard a young man ask his father, quietly, whether it was true that Chief Adeyemi's construction company still hadn't paid the families of the 3 workers who died on the Lekki site 2 years ago. That last conversation made her pause, just for a second, tray balanced against her hip. She filed it away. It was nearly 9 when the accident happened. If it could even be called an accident. Folake had summoned Adaize to refill her champagne for the 4th time, and something in the older woman's steady, unhurried pace irritated her in a way she couldn't quite name. Perhaps it was that Rose didn't scurry. Perhaps it was that she looked people in the eye when she spoke, which the help wasn't supposed to do. Not really, not in a way that suggested equality. Perhaps, and this was the truth Folake would never admit, not even to herself, it was that something about this particular maid's calm made Folake feel, for one disorienting second, like the smaller person in the room. "You're slow tonight," Folake said, loud enough for the nearest table to hear. "My apologies, madam. Do you even understand what an event like this costs? What 1 bottle of what you're pouring costs? I imagine it's more than I'll see in a year," Adaize said evenly. It was, technically, true. She hadn't drawn a personal salary from Adichok Logistics in 3 years. She lived, when she wasn't in disguise, almost entirely off dividends she rarely touched. The answer, so calm, so lacking in the shame Folake had wanted to provoke, seemed to detonate something in her. "Then maybe you should be more careful," Folake snapped, and reached out to steady the tray herself. Too hard, too fast. The gesture wasn't designed to help. Everyone at the table would later disagree, gently, about whether it was deliberate. But the tray tipped, and a full glass of red wine arced through the air and struck Adaize across the front of her uniform, and the plate of small chops beside it followed, scattering fried plantain and suya across the white tablecloth like shrapnel. The garden went silent. Adaize stood very still, wine soaking dark through white fabric, and for one long moment she said nothing at all. Somewhere behind her, she heard Chief Adeyemi's chair scrape back. Folake, perhaps sensing that the silence was working against her, laughed. A short, brittle sound meant to reframe the moment as comedy rather than cruelty. "Careful," she said again, to the table now, not to Adaize. "This is why you train your staff properly." "She didn't do anything," said a voice, not Bio's. His sister Yetunde, half risen from her seat, red spots blooming on her cheeks. "Foleke, that was you. Everyone saw." "I was trying to help her balance the tray." "You grabbed it and shoved it into her chest." The guests had gone quiet in the particular way a room goes quiet when it's deciding, collectively, whether to believe what it just watched or the easier story being offered to replace it. A few looked away. A few reached instinctively for their phones, not to record, not yet, but out of the modern reflex to document a moment before deciding what to do with it. Adaeze set the tray down on the nearest table, unhurried, and looked at the wine soaking into the front of her uniform. Then she looked up, not at Foleke, but past her, at Bayo, who had crossed half the garden and now stood close enough that she could see the tightness in his jaw. "Are you hurt?" he asked her directly. Not "is everything all right?" A host's deflecting question. He asked her plainly, as though she were a guest and not staff, as though the answer mattered to him specifically. "No," Adaeze said, "only my uniform. I'll have someone bring you a change of clothes." And he turned, finally, to Foleke, and his voice dropped into a register his sister hadn't heard from him in years. Not since their father's funeral. Not since the day he'd fired his own cousin for stealing from the company. "We'll speak about this later, privately. Bayo, it was an accident." "I watched it happen," he said. "I was standing right there." Foleke's face did something complicated then. Anger folding briefly into panic. Panic folding into the practiced recovery of a woman who had spent years learning how to win rooms. She smiled, too wide, and reached for her champagne. "Well," she said to the table at large, "I suppose we've had our entertainment for the evening." Nobody laughed this time. Adaeze excused herself toward the kitchen, wine dripping from the hem of her apron, and it was there, in the narrow service hallway behind the main kitchen, away from the golden light and the band still playing as though nothing had happened, that she allowed herself, finally, to feel something. Not humiliation. She had built armor against that decades ago, back when men in suits used to look through her the way Foleke had looked through her tonight. Back before the money. Back before the world learned to say her name with a different kind of respect. What she felt instead was colder and more useful. Certainty. She had come to this house to learn something true about the family her staffing agency contact had described in passing as old money getting new money. She had learned it faster than expected. But there was something else now. Something that pulled at her more than Foleke's cruelty. The fragment of conversation she'd overheard earlier. 3 families. The Lecky site. Still haven't been paid. She pulled her phone from the hidden pocket she'd sewn into every uniform she wore on these assignments, and typed a single message to her chief of staff in Lagos, a woman named Chiamaka, who was, at that moment, the only other person alive who knew where Adaeze truly was tonight. Pull everything on Adayemi Construction. Lecky site, 2 years back. Worker deaths. I want it by morning. She had barely pressed send when the kitchen door opened behind her, and Chief Bayo Adeyemi stepped through it alone, holding, absurdly, a folded white shirt that clearly belonged to one of his own household staff. "I brought you something dry," he said, "and I owe you an apology on behalf of my house." Adaeze looked at him for a long moment. This man whose company, it seemed, owed far more than an apology to people who could not afford to wait for one. And she made a decision that would unravel everything by the end of the night. "Thank you," she said quietly. "But before I change, may I ask you something, Chief Adeyemi? About the Lecky construction site, 2 years ago." She watched every trace of warmth drain from his face. "How?" he said slowly. "Does a new housemaid know about that?" Behind them, through the kitchen window, The string lights in the garden flickered once, and somewhere out past the hedges, a car none of the household staff recognized pulled quietly through the gate. The first of three, though no one inside the house had any reason yet to notice. Bio didn't answer right away. He set the folded shirt down on the stainless steel counter between them, buying himself a few seconds, the way men who have spent decades in boardrooms learn to do when a question lands somewhere they didn't want it to. "That's not something I discuss with staff," he said finally, and even he seemed to hear how weak it sounded the moment it left his mouth. "I'm not asking as staff," Adaeze said. "I'm asking because 3 men are dead, and their families are still waiting for something your company promised them." "You're not staff," he said slowly. "No." "Then who—" "My name is Adaeze Chukwuma," she said, and watched the name land on him the way names like that land on people who read the business pages. First confusion, then disbelief, then the particular vertigo of realizing you insulted someone you'll spend years apologizing for. "I own Adachuk Logistics. I do this twice a year. Take work under another name. See what a household is really like when it thinks no one who matters is watching. Tonight, I learned 2 things. I learned what your fiancé thinks of people she believes are beneath her. And I learned that your company has been sitting on money owed to 3 grieving families for 2 years, while you paid for a party with a live band flown in from Accra." The kitchen was silent except for the distant thump of music from the garden, still playing, still oblivious. "I didn't know," Bayo said, and it came out smaller than he meant it to. "About the fund being reclassified. I swear to you, I didn't know." "Then you should ask your fiancé," Adaeze said, because the reclassification request came from an email address registered to her. What happened next did not happen quickly, and it did not happen the way anyone in that garden might have imagined a scandal unfolding. No shouting, no dramatic unmasking in front of 200 guests. Adaeze insisted on that. She had learned, over the years, that public humiliation taught people nothing except how to hide better. What she wanted was accountability, not spectacle. She changed out of the wine-soaked uniform in the staff quarters, alone, and when she emerged 20 minutes later in clothes Chiamaka had brought, simple, well-made, unmistakably the clothes of a woman who had never needed a uniform to prove anything, she asked Bayo for one thing, a quiet room, and Folak, and 45 minutes before anyone else needed to know what she'd found. Folake arrived in the study already defensive, already rehearsing the version of the evening where she was the wronged party. She stopped in the doorway when she saw who was sitting across from her fiancé. The maid, unmistakably the maid. Wine stain barely dry on the discarded uniform folded on the chair beside her, now dressed like she owned the room, which, as it happened, she very nearly could have. "What is this?" Folek said. "Sit down," Bayo said. His voice had a flatness in it that made her actually do it. Adayaz didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. She laid out in the plain, unhurried tone of someone who had built a company by never bluffing, exactly what she'd found in the hour since Chiamaka arrived. The reclassified compensation fund, the email trail, the 3 families in Lekki who had been told repeatedly that the paperwork was still processing, while renovation invoices for the Ikoyi mansion cleared without delay. Foleka's face went through several expressions in quick succession. Outrage, calculation, something that might have been fear, before settling on the only one that had ever worked for her before. Righteous indignation. "I was managing the company's risk," she said. "Those families were threatening to go to the press. I protected this family." "You protected yourself," Bayo said quietly, "from embarrassment, while men who died building my company's towers were being told to wait. Bayo, I watched you humiliate a woman tonight because you thought she couldn't afford to matter," he said. "And now I find out you did the same thing to 3 families who buried their fathers because of my company. I don't think you were protecting this family, Folake. I think you were protecting the version of yourself that can't stand to remember she used to have nothing." The silence that followed was the loudest thing that had happened all evening. Folake looked, for a moment, like she might argue further. Then something in her seemed to collapse inward. Not into remorse, not yet, but into the exhausted recognition that the story she'd been telling about herself for years had just run out of road. "You don't understand what it's like," she said, quieter now, "to claw your way into a room like this and know that everyone's still waiting for you to slip, so they can say you never really belonged." "I understand it better than you know," Adayezi said, and for the first time that night, something almost gentle moved through her voice. "I grew up in Ajagunle, in a house where rain came through the roof. I understand exactly what it costs to build yourself out of nothing. But I never let it turn me into someone who needed to stand on other people's necks to feel tall. That's the difference. Not where you started. What you did once you arrived." The engagement did not survive the week, not because Bayo staged some dramatic public rejection, but because Folake, faced with the full accounting of what had been done in her name, chose to leave before she could be asked to. She flew to London 2 days later, telling the few friends who still returned her calls that Lagos had gotten too small for her. No one corrected her, though several of them knew better. The compensation to the Lekki families was paid in full within the month, with interest, and Bayo personally visited each household, something he admitted, quietly, to Adaize he should have done 2 years earlier, before he let a spreadsheet stand between him and 3 widows. "I got comfortable," he told her, the last time they spoke, in the same study where the truth had first come apart. "I built towers, and told myself the people inside them mattered more than the people who built them. I don't know when that happened." "It happened slowly," Adaize said. "That's what makes it dangerous. Nobody wakes up one morning and decides to stop seeing people. It erodes. How do you keep it from happening to you? She thought about the rain on a tin roof, 20-some years gone now, and the particular sound it used to make. I go back, she said simply. Not literally, but I make myself remember, on purpose, twice a year, what it feels like to be the person nobody looks at twice. It's uncomfortable. It's supposed to be. He didn't offer her a job or an investment or any of the things men in his position usually offered when they wanted to keep someone useful close. He only nodded and thanked her, and asked if she'd consider, someday, telling him more about Adichuk's supply chain work. Not as a business opportunity, he said, but because he wanted to understand what a company looked like when it was built by someone who never forgot where she started. She said maybe. She meant it. The video from the garden had, by then, been watched several million times, though by unspoken agreement between everyone who mattered. The story that traveled with it was never about a billionaire in disguise. It was simply a video of a woman who spilled wine on someone and made excuses instead of apologizing. A small, ordinary cruelty. The kind that happens in kitchens and offices and dinner parties every day. Usually without consequence. Adais never confirmed publicly who she was that night. Some things, she believed, were worth more left unproven. Because the moment a story becomes about the shock of her wealth, it stops being about the truth it revealed. That the measure of a person isn't how they treat the people who can do something for them, but how they treat the ones who, as far as they know, never will. She flew back to her own life 2 days later, past the same gates that had made the neighborhood children marvel, and the last thing she did before leaving Lagos was send a single message to the Lecky families. Not from Adichuk Logistics, not with her name attached, just a small transfer to each household and 4 words in the memo line, from someone who remembers. If this story stayed with you, I'd love to hear which part of it did. The wine, the reveal, or the quiet ending. Down in the comments. And if you'd like more stories like this one, consider joining us here at MyCoin, where we keep telling the truths that dinner parties try so hard to dress up.